The Renault Ruski, also known as the Tank M, was the first tank produced in the Soviet Union, entering service in 1920. It was a direct copy of the French Renault FT, weighing 7 metric tons and measuring 5 meters in length. The vehicle was armed with either a 37mm Puteaux gun or a 7.62mm machine gun, and was operated by a crew of 2. Its 39-horsepower engine provided a maximum speed of 8 kilometers per hour and a range of 60 kilometers. Only 15 units were manufactured at the Krasnoye Sormovo factory. It served primarily as a foundational project for Soviet heavy industry, although its performance was limited by a fragile transmission and very slow operational speed. The T-18 light tank, or MS-1, was the first Soviet-designed tank to enter mass production, starting in 1928. It weighed 5.9 metric tons and was armed with a 37mm Model 1928 gun and 2 7.62mm machine guns. The vehicle featured a 35-horsepower engine, allowing for a top speed of 16 kilometers per hour. With 16 millimeters of vertical armor, it was intended for infantry support. Between 1928 and 1931, approximately 960 units were produced. While it performed well against non-industrialized forces in the 1929 Sino-Soviet conflict, its narrow tracks and low power made it difficult to maneuver in deep mud or across wide trenches. The T-27 tankette entered service in 1931 as a license-produced and modified version of the British Carden Loyd Mark V. It weighed 2.7 metric tons and was armed with a single 7.62mm DT machine gun. The vehicle was 2.6 meters long and reached speeds of 42 kilometers per hour using a 40-horsepower Ford AA engine. A total of 3,328 units were built for reconnaissance and towing roles. The T-27 lacked a rotating turret, forcing the driver to turn the entire vehicle to aim. Its thin 10mm armor was vulnerable to nearly all anti-tank rifles and heavy machine guns, leading to its withdrawal from frontline service by 1941. The T-24 medium tank was produced in 1931 as an indigenous design to replace imported models. It weighed 18.5 metric tons and featured a 45mm main gun alongside 3 7.62mm machine guns. The tank utilized a 250-horsepower engine, reaching a top speed of 25 kilometers per hour with a crew of 5. Only 24 units were completed before the project was canceled in favor of the BT series. While it featured an advanced triple-turret configuration for its time, the T-24 suffered from persistent mechanical unreliability, specifically regarding its complex drivetrain and suspension system, which frequently failed during field trials. The T-26 light tank entered service in 1931 and became one of the most widely produced tanks of the interwar period. It weighed 10.6 metric tons and was armed with a 45mm 20K gun and 2 machine guns. The vehicle was powered by a 90-horsepower air-cooled engine, providing a maximum speed of 31 kilometers per hour. Over 10,000 units were manufactured in dozens of variants, including flamethrowing and twin-turret models. It saw extensive combat in the Spanish Civil War and against Japanese forces at Khalkhin Gol. Its primary weakness was its thin, riveted armor, which offered no protection against modern 37mm anti-tank guns. The BT-2 fast tank was introduced in 1932, based on the American Christie suspension system. It weighed 10.2 metric tons and was armed with a 37mm gun. The unique suspension allowed the tank to travel on tracks or on its road wheels alone, reaching 52 kilometers per hour on tracks and 72 kilometers per hour on wheels. It was powered by a 400-horsepower Liberty engine. The BT-2 was designed for deep penetration operations behind enemy lines. However, the engine was prone to catching fire, and the early 37mm gun lacked the high explosive capability needed for effective infantry support during breakthroughs.
The T-37A amphibious light tank entered production in 1933. It weighed 3.2 metric tons and was armed with a single 7.62mm DT machine gun in a rotating turret. The vehicle was 3.75 meters long and could reach 30 kilometers per hour on land and 6 kilometers per hour in water using a rear-mounted propeller. It was the first mass-produced amphibious tank in the world, with over 2,500 units built. Its primary role was reconnaissance and river crossings. The T-37A had very thin armor of only 9 millimeters and was notoriously unstable in choppy water, leading to several accidental sinkings during training. The T-28 medium tank entered service in 1933 as a multi-turreted breakthrough vehicle. It weighed 28 metric tons and featured one main turret with a 76.2mm gun and 2 smaller machine gun turrets. Powered by a 500-horsepower M17 engine, it reached 37 kilometers per hour. The tank was 7.44 meters long and carried a crew of 6. Approximately 500 units were produced. While it was advanced for the early 1930s, the multi-turret layout proved difficult for the commander to coordinate. During the Winter War against Finland, its armor was found insufficient against 37mm anti-tank guns, necessitating the addition of applique armor plates. The T-35 heavy tank was introduced in 1933 as a symbol of Soviet industrial power. It weighed 45 metric tons and featured 5 separate turrets, one with a 76.2mm gun, 2 with 45mm guns, and 2 with machine guns. It required a crew of 11 men and reached a speed of 30 km per hour. Only 61 units were ever produced. The T-35 was impressive in parades but a failure in combat. Its enormous size made it an easy target, and the internal mechanics were so complex that most units were abandoned due to mechanical breakdown during the initial German invasion in 1941. The BT-5 fast tank entered production in 1933 as an improvement over the BT-2. It weighed 11.5 metric tons and was upgraded with a 45mm 20K gun in a new cylindrical turret. The vehicle used a 450 horsepower M5 engine, maintaining the Christie suspension's high speed of 72 km per hour on wheels. It carried a crew of 3 and had a range of 200 kilometers. The BT-5 was highly mobile but lacked adequate armor protection. In the Spanish Civil War, it proved capable of destroying contemporary German and Italian tanks, though it remained highly vulnerable to even small-caliber anti-tank weaponry. The BA-3 heavy armored car entered service in 1934. It weighed 5.8 metric tons and was built on a 6x4 Ford Timken chassis. It used the same turret as the T-26 and BT-5 tanks, armed with a 45mm gun and 2 machine guns. The vehicle reached a top speed of 63 km per hour on roads and had 15mm of armor. While its firepower was exceptional for an armored car of the era, its off-road mobility was poor due to its high weight and narrow tires. It was often fitted with overall tracks on the rear wheels to improve traction in snow or mud. The BT-7 fast tank was introduced in 1935 as the final major version of the BT series. It weighed 13.8 metric tons and featured a redesigned hull with sloped front armor and a 450 horsepower M17 engine. The tank reached speeds of 72 km per hour and was armed with a 45mm gun and 2 machine guns. Over 7,000 units were produced. The BT-7 participated in the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, where its speed allowed for successful flanking maneuvers. Its main flaw was the highly flammable petrol engine and its relatively thin armor, which was easily penetrated by 37mm and 47mm anti-tank fire.
The T-38 amphibious light tank entered service in 1936, replacing the T-37A. It weighed 3.3 metric tons and was armed with a 7.62mm machine gun. It featured a wider, flatter hull for better stability in water and a 40 horsepower Gaz-AA engine. Top speed was 40 km per hour on land and 6 km per hour in water. Around 1,300 units were built. Despite the design improvements, the T-38 remained underpowered and underarmed. It lacked a radio in most units, making coordination difficult. By 1941, it was considered obsolete and was relegated to secondary roles like patrolling and driver training. The BA-6 heavy armored car was produced starting in 1936. It weighed 5.1 metric tons and was an evolutionary step from the BA-3, featuring the same 45mm gun turret but with improved tires and a slightly lightened chassis. It reached 43 km per hour and carried a crew of 4. The BA-6 utilized a 40 horsepower engine and had a range of 200 kilometers. Like its predecessor, it had a heavy armament for an armored car, but suffered from thin 9mm armor. It was used extensively in the Spanish Civil War and the early stages of World War II. The BA-10 heavy armored car was introduced in 1938 and became the most produced Soviet heavy armored car. It weighed 5.1 metric tons and was armed with a 45mm gun and 2 7.62mm machine guns. The vehicle featured a 50 horsepower engine and achieved a top speed of 52 km per hour on roads. The BA-10 had improved sloping armor compared to the BA-6, reaching 15mm in thickness. It was effective against infantry and light vehicles, but was frequently destroyed when forced into direct engagements with tanks due to its high profile and vulnerable wheeled suspension. The T-40 amphibious scout tank entered production in 1939. It weighed 5.9 metric tons and was armed with a 12.7mm DSHK heavy machine gun and a 7.62mm DT machine gun. The vehicle was powered by an 85 horsepower Gaz-11 engine, allowing for a top speed of 44 km per hour on land and 6 km per hour in water. It featured a built-in propeller and rudders for aquatic propulsion. While it was a successful reconnaissance design, the desperate need for tanks during the 1941 German invasion led to the removal of its amphibious equipment to speed up production of land-only versions. The T-26-4 was an experimental artillery support version of the T-26, produced in 1939. It weighed 10.3 metric tons and replaced the standard 45mm gun with a 76.2mm KT-26 pack howitzer in an enlarged turret. The vehicle was intended to provide close-range fire support for infantry and light tank units. Only a small number were produced because the recoil of the 76mm gun was too powerful for the light T-26 chassis, causing structural damage to the turret ring and suspension during sustained firing. This prompted the shift toward dedicated self-propelled guns. The KV-1 heavy tank entered service in 1939. It weighed 45 metric tons and featured 75mm of armor, which was virtually impenetrable to all German anti-tank guns at the start of Operation Barbarossa. It was armed with a 76.2mm ZIS-5 gun and 3 machine guns. The tank was powered by a 600-horsepower V2 diesel engine, reaching 35 km per hour. While its protection was revolutionary, the KV-1 suffered from a heavy, unreliable transmission and poor visibility for the crew. Many units were lost not to enemy fire, but to mechanical failures and the inability of bridges to support their weight.
The T-34 Model 1940 entered production in 1940 and fundamentally changed tank design. It weighed 26 metric tons and featured 45mm sloped armor, which significantly increased its effective thickness against anti-tank fire. It was armed with the 76.2mm L11 gun and powered by the 500-horsepower V2 diesel engine, allowing speeds of 53 km per hour. Its wide tracks provided excellent mobility in mud and snow. Early models suffered from poor crew ergonomics and vision devices, but its balance of firepower, protection, and mobility set a new global standard for medium tanks. The KV-2 heavy tank was introduced in 1940 as a specialized bunker buster. It weighed 52 metric tons and featured a massive slab-sided turret housing a 152mm M10T howitzer. The vehicle reached a top speed of 28 km per hour. Its purpose was to destroy heavy fortifications during the Winter War. The KV-2 was extremely top-heavy and could only rotate its turret on level ground. If the tank was at an angle, the turret motor lacked the power to turn it. Most KV-2s were abandoned in 1941 after running out of fuel or suffering mechanical breakdowns that could not be repaired in the field. The T-50 light tank entered service in 1941. It weighed 13.8 metric tons and featured 37mm of highly sloped armor, making it as well protected as many medium tanks. It was armed with a 45mm gun and 2 machine guns. Powered by a 300-horsepower V4 diesel engine, it reached 60 km per hour. Despite being an excellent design with a 3-man turret and commander's cupola, it was too expensive and complex to produce during the wartime crisis. Only 69 units were built before production was halted in favor of the simpler T-60 and T-70 series. The T-60 light tank was rushed into production in 1941 to replace the losses of the first months of the war. It weighed 5.8 metric tons and was armed with a 20mm TNS autocannon and a 7.62mm machine gun. The vehicle utilized a 70-horsepower engine, reaching 44 km per hour. It was designed to be built in factories that lacked heavy machinery, such as automotive plants. Its armor was only 20mm thick, and its 20mm gun was ineffective against all but the lightest German vehicles, earning it the nickname Brother's Grave among Soviet crews. The T-70 light tank was introduced in 1942 to replace the underarmed T-60. It weighed 9.2 metric tons and was armed with a 45mm gun and a 7.62mm machine gun. It was powered by 2 70-horsepower engines linked together, reaching a speed of 45 km per hour. Over 8,000 units were produced. The T-70 had a major design flaw. It had a one-man turret, meaning the commander had to load, aim, and fire the gun while also trying to command the vehicle and maintain situational awareness. This severely limited its combat efficiency in complex engagements. The BA-64 light armored car entered service in 1942. It weighed 2.4 metric tons and was based on the chassis of the GAZ-64 Jeep. It featured a 7.62mm DT machine gun in an open-topped octagonal turret and was protected by 15mm of sloped armor. The vehicle reached a top speed of 80 km per hour and had a range of 600 km. It was primarily used for liaison and reconnaissance duties. While fast and reliable, its narrow track made it prone to flipping over when cornering at high speeds on uneven terrain. The Su-76 self-propelled gun entered production in 1942. It weighed 10.6 metric tons and featured a 76.2mm ZIS-3 gun mounted on a modified T-70 chassis. The vehicle reached a top speed of 45 km per hour. It was the second most produced Soviet armored vehicle of the war, after the T-34. It provided highly mobile fire support for infantry. Early versions had an enclosed roof that trapped exhaust fumes, but most units were open-topped. Crews disliked the thin armor and the open rear, which provided no protection from grenades or small arms fire from the flanks.
The Su-122 assault gun was introduced in 1943. It weighed 31 metric tons and featured a 122mm M30S howitzer, mounted in a fixed casemate on a T-34 chassis. The vehicle reached a speed of 55 kilometers per hour and carried 40 rounds of ammunition. It was designed to provide heavy, high-explosive fire against bunkers and infantry positions. Its thick frontal armor allowed it to operate near the front lines, but its slow rate of fire and lack of a rotating turret made it vulnerable to flanking maneuvers by enemy anti-tank units. The Su-85 tank destroyer entered service in 1943 to counter the new German Tiger and Panther tanks. It weighed 29.6 metric tons and carried an 85mm D5S gun on a T-34 chassis. The vehicle reached 55 kilometers per hour and had 45mm of frontal armor. The 85mm gun could penetrate the Tiger's armor at 1,000 meters, providing the Red Army with a much-needed mobile anti-tank capability. However, once the T-34-85 tank was introduced with the same gun in a rotating turret, the Su-85 became redundant and was eventually phased out. The IS-1 heavy tank, named after Joseph Stalin, was introduced in 1943. It weighed 44 metric tons and was armed with an 85mm D5T gun. It was designed to replace the KV series, featuring much better armor layout and a lower profile. The vehicle reached 37 kilometers per hour using a 600 horsepower diesel engine. Only 107 units were built because the 85mm gun was quickly deemed insufficient for a heavy tank. Most were later rearmed or replaced by the IS-2, which featured a significantly more powerful 122mm main armament. The ISU-152 self-propelled gun entered service in 1943, earning the nickname Zvereboy, or Beast Killer. It weighed 46 metric tons and was armed with a 152.4mm ML-20S gun howitzer. Built on the IS heavy tank chassis, it reached 37 kilometers per hour and featured 90mm of frontal armor. The massive 43-kilogram shells could blow the turrets off Tiger tanks through pure kinetic energy and blast force, even without penetrating. Its primary disadvantages were the very low rate of fire, about 2 rounds per minute, and a limited internal ammunition supply of only 20 rounds, forcing crews to be extremely selective with their shots. The IS-2 heavy tank was introduced in 1944. It weighed 46 metric tons and featured a massive 122mm D25T gun, capable of destroying any German tank at long range. The armor was 120mm thick on the hull front. The vehicle reached 37 kilometers per hour. It was instrumental in the final breakthroughs into Germany. Its main flaw was the use of two-part ammunition. The shell and the propellant were loaded separately, which resulted in a slow rate of fire and limited the ammunition capacity to only 28 rounds, forcing crews to be extremely selective with their shots. The ISU-122 tank destroyer entered service in 1944 as a variant of the ISU-152. It weighed 45.5 metric tons and featured a 122mm A19S gun. The 122mm gun had a higher muzzle velocity and better armor penetration than the 152mm gun, making it more effective in the dedicated anti-tank role. The vehicle reached a speed of 37 kilometers per hour. While highly effective, it shared the same limitations as other casemate-style vehicles, including a limited horizontal traverse of the gun, which required the driver to pivot the entire tank to track moving targets.
The Su-100 tank destroyer was introduced in 1944 to replace the Su-85. It weighed 31.6 metric tons and featured a powerful 100mm D10S gun on a T-34 chassis. The gun could penetrate 125mm of vertical armor at a range of 2,000 meters. The vehicle reached 50 kilometers per hour. The Su-100 was highly successful and remained in service with various nations into the 21st century. Its primary issue was the extreme length of the gun barrel, which tended to dig into the ground when the vehicle moved across steep or uneven terrain. The T-44 medium tank entered production in 1944, but did not see combat in World War II. It weighed 31.9 metric tons and featured an 85mm gun. The T-44 was a revolutionary design that moved the engine transversely, allowing for a much larger fighting compartment and a more centered turret compared to the T-34. It reached 53 kilometers per hour and had 120mm of frontal armor. Though a superior tank, production was kept low to avoid disrupting the massive T-34-85 lines. It served as the direct technological bridge to the T-54-55 series. The IS-3 heavy tank was introduced in 1945, famously appearing at the Berlin Victory Parade. It weighed 46 metric tons and featured a radical pike nose hull and a hemispherical frying pan turret, providing extreme ballistic protection. It was armed with a 122mm gun and reached 37 kilometers per hour. While terrifying to Western observers, the IS-3 suffered from severe structural problems. The welds on the pike nose often cracked under the stress of off-road driving, and the cramped interior made it difficult for the crew to operate efficiently over long periods. The BTR-40 was the first mass-produced Soviet-wheeled armored personnel carrier, entering service in 1950. It weighed 5.3 metric tons and was based on a 4x4 truck chassis. It was armed with a 7.62mm machine gun and could carry 8 infantrymen. The vehicle reached 80 kilometers per hour on roads. The BTR-40 was open-topped, leaving the crew and passengers completely exposed to overhead shell splinters and grenades. It was primarily used for reconnaissance and as a command vehicle, until more advanced, fully enclosed armored personnel carriers became available. The T-54 main battle tank entered service in 1949, and, along with the T-55, became the most produced tank in history. It weighed 36 metric tons and featured a 100mm D-10T rifled gun. Powered by a 520 horsepower engine, it reached 48 kilometers per hour. The frontal armor was 100mm thick and highly sloped. The T-54 set the standard for Soviet tank design with its low profile and high firepower. However, its low height resulted in a very cramped interior, and the gun could not be depressed significantly, making it difficult to fire from hold-down positions on hills. The BTR-152 entered service in 1950 as a 6x6 armored personnel carrier. It weighed 9.9 metric tons and could carry up to 18 soldiers. It was armed with a 7.62mm machine gun and reached speeds of 75 kilometers per hour. The vehicle was based on the ZIS-151 truck chassis. Like the BTR-40, earlier versions were open-topped, which proved to be a major liability in urban combat and against artillery. Later versions added an armored roof. Its main drawback was its poor off-road performance compared to tracked vehicles, as its heavy weight often caused it to bog down in soft soil. The PT-76 amphibious light tank was introduced in 1991. It weighed 14.6 metric tons and was armed with a 76.2mm D-76T gun. It featured a unique water jet propulsion system that allowed it to swim at 10 kilometers per hour while reaching 44 kilometers per hour on land. It was designed for reconnaissance and leading amphibious landings. The PT-76 had very thin armor, maximum 25 millimeters, meaning it could be penetrated by heavy machine guns. Despite this, its excellent mobility in water and marshy terrain made it a staple of Soviet naval infantry and many export customers.
The ASU-57 was a tiny, air-transportable, self-propelled gun introduced in 1951 for paratroopers. It weighed only 3.4 metric tons and was armed with a 57mm CHA-51 gun. It was small enough to be carried inside transport aircraft or dropped by parachute on a pallet. The vehicle reached 45 kilometers per hour, but had no roof and only 6 millimeters of armor, providing protection only against light small arms fire. It was designed to provide airborne troops with immediate anti-tank support, but it was quickly outclassed by the rapid thickening of tank armor in the 1950s. The T-55 main battle tank was introduced in 1958 as an upgrade to the T-54. It weighed 36 metric tons and looked nearly identical to its predecessor, but featured a full NBC, nuclear, biological, chemical, protection system and an increased ammunition load. It was armed with the 100mm D-10T2S gun and reached 50 kilometers per hour. The T-55 was exceptionally reliable and easy to maintain, which led to its use in dozens of conflicts globally. Its main weakness in later years was the lack of sophisticated fire control systems and the aging 100mm gun's inability to penetrate modern composite armor. The BTR-60 was the first Soviet 8-wheeled armored personnel carrier, entering service in 1960. It weighed 10.3 metric tons and was fully amphibious. It reached 80 kilometers per hour on roads and 10 kilometers per hour in water. The vehicle featured two 90-horsepower engines, which were difficult to synchronize and maintain. Earlier versions were open-topped, but the BTR-60PB version added a fully enclosed turret with a 14.5mm heavy machine gun. The side-mounted doors were small and difficult for troops to use quickly, especially when the vehicle was moving or under fire. The T-62 main battle tank entered service in 1961. It weighed 37 metric tons and was the first production tank to feature a smoothbore gun, the 115mm U-5TS. This gun fired high-velocity APFSDS rounds with excellent penetration. The tank reached 50 kilometers per hour.
While the gun was powerful, the tank featured an automatic shell casing ejector that required the gun to be moved to a specific elevation after every shot, significantly slowing the rate of fire. Additionally, the interior was even more cramped than the T-55, leading to rapid crew exhaustion. The BRDM-2 amphibious scout car was introduced in 1962. It weighed 7.7 metric tons and featured a 14.5mm KPVT heavy machine gun and a small turret. Its top speed was 100 km per hour on roads. A unique feature was the 4 small belly wheels that could be lowered to help the vehicle cross wide trenches or difficult terrain. It was fully amphibious and widely used for reconnaissance and as a platform for anti-tank missiles. The main drawback was the lack of any hatches on the sides, forcing the crew to exit through 2 roof hatches, which was dangerous under fire. The ZSU-234 Shilka entered service in 1962 as a self-propelled anti-aircraft gun. It weighed 19 metric tons and was armed with 4 23mm autocannons capable of firing 4,000 rounds per minute. It featured an integrated RPK-2 radar for tracking and engaging low-flying aircraft. The vehicle reached 50 km per hour. The Shilka was highly effective against jets and also served as a devastating direct-fire weapon against ground targets. Its radar was prone to overheating, and the 23mm rounds lacked the range to engage modern attack helicopters equipped with long-range anti-tank missiles.
The ASU-85 was an airborne self-propelled gun introduced in 1959. It weighed 15.5 metric tons and featured an 85mm gun mounted in a fully enclosed casemate. It was based on the PT-76 chassis, but lacked amphibious capabilities. The vehicle was designed to be landed by transport aircraft to support paratroopers. It reached 45 km per hour and had 45mm of frontal armor. While it provided much better protection and firepower than the ASU-57, it was still vulnerable to most anti-tank weapons and was eventually replaced by the more versatile BMD series of airborne fighting vehicles. The BMP-1 entered service in 1966 as the world's first mass-produced infantry fighting vehicle. It weighed 13.2 metric tons and was armed with a 73mm low-pressure smoothbore gun and a Malyataka anti-tank missile. It carried 8 infantrymen who could fire their rifles through ports in the sides. The vehicle reached 65 km per hour and was fully amphibious. While revolutionary, the 73mm gun was inaccurate at long range and was affected by wind. The fuel tanks were located in the rear doors, creating a significant fire hazard for troops exiting the vehicle during combat. The T-64 main battle tank was introduced in 1966 as a highly advanced, secretive design. It weighed 38 metric tons and featured the first use of composite armor and a 125mm smoothbore gun with an autoloader. This reduced the crew to 3. It reached 60 km per hour. The T-64 was significantly more capable than Western tanks of the time, but its 5TD diesel engine and complex suspension were notoriously unreliable. Because of its complexity and high cost, it was never exported and was only issued to elite Soviet units stationed in East Germany. The BMD-1 was an airborne infantry fighting vehicle introduced in 1969. It weighed only 7.5 metric tons and featured the same turret and 73mm gun as the BMP-1. It was designed to be dropped by parachute with its crew inside. The vehicle used a 240 horsepower engine and achieved 80 km per hour. It featured adjustable hydro-pneumatic suspension to lower its height for transport. The BMD-1 was extremely cramped, and its magnesium alloy hull, while light, was highly flammable if struck by shaped charged ammunition, posing a severe risk to the paratroopers inside. The 2S-1 Gwiazdelka entered service in 1971 as an amphibious self-propelled howitzer. It weighed 16 metric tons and was armed with a 122mm 2A-18 howitzer. Based on the MTLB multipurpose chassis, it reached 60 km per hour on roads and 4.5 km per hour in water. It provided divisional artillery with the mobility to keep pace with fast-moving armored units. The 2S-1 was highly successful due to its low profile and ease of maintenance. Its armor was only 20 mm thick, meaning it had to rely on its mobility and range of 15 km to stay safe. The T-72 main battle tank entered service in 1973 as a more cost-effective alternative to the complex T-64. It weighed 41 metric tons and featured a 125mm 2A-46 smoothbore gun equipped with an autoloader. The vehicle was powered by a 780 horsepower V46 diesel engine,
reaching a top speed of 60 kilometers per hour. Its armor consisted of composite materials. Over 25,000 units were produced, making it one of the most widely exported tanks in the world. It became known for catastrophic ammunition explosions if the hull was penetrated, as the ammunition was stored in a carousel around the crew.
The 2S3 Akatsiya was introduced in 1971 to counter the American M109. It weighed 28 metric tons and featured a 152.4 millimeter howitzer in a rotating turret. It reached a top speed of 63 kilometers per hour on roads. The 2S3 could fire a variety of shells, including nuclear and laser-guided projectiles, with a standard range of 18.5 kilometers. It was much better suited for high-intensity conflict than towed artillery. However, it carried only 35 rounds of ammunition, and the lack of an automated loading system meant the rate of fire was limited to about 3 rounds per minute. The BTR-70 was introduced in 1972 as an improvement over the BTR-60. It weighed 11.5 metric tons and retained the 14.5 millimeter heavy machine gun. The vehicle featured two 120 horsepower engines and reached 80 kilometers per hour. The primary improvement was the addition of small exit hatches between the second and third sets of wheels, though these were still difficult to use. The BTR-70 suffered from the same engine synchronization issues as the BTR-60, and its thin armor remained vulnerable to heavy machine guns and anti-tank mines commonly encountered during the conflict in Afghanistan. The T-80 main battle tank entered service in 1976 and was the first Soviet tank to use a gas turbine engine. It weighed 42.5 metric tons and was armed with a 125mm smoothbore gun. The 1,000 horsepower turbine allowed for a top speed of 70 kilometers per hour and excellent acceleration. It featured advanced composite armor and could fire anti-tank missiles through the main gun. The gas turbine engine consumed enormous amounts of fuel, giving the tank a very limited operational range. Furthermore, the engine was difficult to maintain and was highly sensitive to dust and dirt ingestion. The BMP-2 was introduced in 1980 to address the shortcomings of the BMP-1. It weighed 14.3 metric tons and replaced the 73mm gun with a long-barreled 30mm 2A42 autocannon. This weapon was much more effective against helicopters, infantry, and light armor. The vehicle carried 7 soldiers and reached 65 kilometers per hour. The turret was enlarged to accommodate 2 men, allowing the commander to better view the battlefield. While the firepower was a massive improvement, the armor remained thin and the vehicle was still vulnerable to heavy machine guns from the sides and rear. The BMD-2 was introduced in 1985 as an upgrade to the BMD-1 for airborne forces. It weighed 11.5 metric tons and utilized the same 30mm autocannon as the BMP-2, giving paratroopers significantly better firepower against both ground and air targets. It reached 80 kilometers per hour and was fully amphibious. The BMD-2 was designed based on lessons learned in Afghanistan, where the 73mm gun of the BMD-1 proved unable to engage targets at high elevations. Despite the new turret, the interior remained extremely cramped, limiting the amount of gear the paratroopers could carry inside the vehicle. The BTR-80 entered service in 1986, representing a major redesign of the Soviet-wheeled APC. It weighed 13.6 metric tons and featured a single 260 horsepower V8 diesel engine, replacing the problematic twin-engine setup of earlier models. It reached 80 kilometers per hour and featured much larger 2-part side doors that allowed infantry to exit more safely and quickly. The vehicle was armed with a 14.5mm heavy machine gun. The BTR-80 was significantly more reliable and became the standard wheeled transport for the Soviet and later Russian armies, though its roof protection against top attack weapons remained minimal.
The BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicle entered service in 1987. It weighed 18.7 metric tons and featured an unusually heavy armament, a 100mm low-pressure gun, a 30mm autocannon, and 3 machine guns. The 100mm gun could also fire anti-tank guided missiles. It reached 72 kilometers per hour and was fully amphibious. The engine was moved to the rear, which required a complex exit route for the infantry over the top of the engine. While it possessed the highest firepower of any IFV in the world, its complex internal layout and thin aluminum armor were significant compromises. The 2S-19 Musta-S self-propelled howitzer was introduced in 1989. It weighed 42 metric tons and was armed with a 152mm 2A64 howitzer. It was built on a hybrid chassis using components from both the T-72 and T-80 tanks.
The vehicle featured an automatic loader, allowing for a rate of fire of 8 rounds per minute, and had a maximum range of 29 kilometers with base bleed shells. Top speed was 60 kilometers per hour. The Musta S was designed to provide highly mobile, heavy fire support, though its large size made it difficult to conceal from modern aerial reconnaissance. The BMD-3 was the final airborne fighting vehicle introduced by the Soviet Union in 1990. It weighed 12.9 metric tons and featured a new, larger hull that provided more internal space and better buoyancy than the BMD-2. It used the same 30mm autocannon turret and was powered by a 450 horsepower engine, reaching 70 kilometers per hour. It was designed to be dropped with its full crew of 7 inside. Despite its capabilities, the collapse of the Soviet Union limited production, and it never fully replaced the older BMD-1 and BMD-2 models in service. The evolution of Soviet armor was defined by a shift from light, fast reconnaissance vehicles to heavily armored, mass-produced main battle tanks designed for deep offensive operations. This systematic focus on standardization, low profiles, and high firepower allowed the Soviet Union to maintain a massive armored presence that shaped global military doctrine for nearly a century.